All right, thank you everyone for attending my presentation on reclaiming space for empathy through humane wilderness education. Now originally this talk I was hoping to have a lot of solid case studies I could discuss with you about projects that are doing humane wilderness education really well. Unfortunately, there are very few projects that are doing what I believe needs to be done at all. So even though there will be some discussion of examples towards the end, the presentation is going to be mostly more theoretical and kind of setting the context and the need for a fusion of wilderness and humane education. I should also apologize that I have a bit of a cold, so if I make gross noises or like my voice kind of fails me, that's the reason why. So.
Do you need some tissue?
I've never touched it.
Firstly, what is wilderness education? So it's a very broad, loosely defined field. Essentially, wilderness education is any form of learning that occurs in outdoor natural environments. It overlaps heavily with outdoor education and with adventure education, which are not exactly synonyms, but they're pretty close. Like outdoor education could include like walking in the city park, which isn't wild. Adventure education could include like indoor rock climbing, which isn't wild, but for the most part, they all are pretty closely related. So typical wilderness, actually I'll show that with photographs what some typical activities might be. But wilderness education can occur in both a formal or an informal learning context. So there you could have primary or secondary education programs, but it can also occur just like within families or within tribal structures. It could include museums, other kinds of informal institutions, public parks. So this is kind of the classic like school camping trip type setting, which is probably the most common form of wilderness education, at least in the developed countries. So just kids going out over a weekend or for a week camping trip and learning about flora and fauna. But wilderness education can also include things like teaching traditional foraging techniques. This is an image from the Tulalip tribes, who are one of the Native American nations in Washington State, where I'm from. Children learning how to gather cedar for traditional baskets and other materials. So Hadas mentioned paleontology. I'm an amateur paleontologist. I don't have credentials in it, but it's something I really love, fossil hunting. And this is the Dig Field School, which is a program in which teachers actually will participate in excavating dinosaur fossils to enable them to connect better with their pupils on subjects relating to science. And something you might notice is that this is actually the first photograph that actually features an animal. Now, admittedly, it's an animal that's been dead for 65 million years. But I personally believe that there's a lot of potential in kind of harnessing many people's, especially children's, interest in paleontology, in dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals, and kind of connecting that interest with life long gone to caring for life that exists in the present and ensuring that it has a better future. However, if I were to talk about this as a presentation, there would be no examples at all, because no one is doing that to the best of my knowledge. And unfortunately, so the last example, I should warn you, does showcase some violence against animals. And unfortunately, wilderness education may also include training in things like hunting and fishing and other practices that are harmful to animals. And this is an element that I very much want to cut against, and why I think I would be for a wilderness education that incorporates the protection of animals rather than condoning things like this. Children being desensitized to killing creatures. So going into some of the theory of wilderness education, this is a model based on one of the largest overviews of different outdoor education programs in various countries that's been done to date, that found that there are 5 main purposes to outdoor education. And so of the 5 purposes, one of them is indirectly relevant to animal protection. That's the environmental purpose. That includes improving environmental attitude, knowledge, and behavior. So that does include like respect for ecology and having as little impact on the environment as possible. But as you notice, it's the last of the 5. And what's worse is that in terms of actual outcomes that were measured in real programs around the world, only 1% of all measured outcomes even related to the environmental impact. And that's in a type of education that the entire point of it, the entire setting, is the natural world. And yet only one outcomes out of 100 relates to treating the natural world with any respect. I think it's a pretty serious problem. That said, to be fair to wilderness education, even though I think it's really missing the point on that, it is effective at achieving the developmental purposes, which relate to things like developing life skills, as well as becoming like a more mature, more responsible person, improving relationships. There is data that shows a strong effect there. And I think that's important because that relates to humane education, which also focuses on developmental skills. Now, there are many different humane education models. To discuss, I've chosen ACT Asia's Caring for Life model, which is a humane education program that's run in many school districts across China. Pei Feng-Su of ACT Asia is the founder of this program, and she's actually at the conference. I believe she'll be presenting tomorrow. So she'll undoubtedly go into way more info and probably correct errors I've made. But like the previous one, this is also, there are 5 main purposes to this, which is why I think it's a good comparison. And you may know that they're very different in some ways, but there's also a similarity in that many of them relate to developmental goals, to things like improving the way that students relate to each other, their feelings of empathy toward animals. But what's different is that it's it's not just one distinct category, it permeates everything, and so does the environmental goal, which explicitly includes compassion for animals, and sort of sets the context for everything else. And this also is shown to be effective. That studies of the Caring for Life model have found that it does significantly improve students' treatment not only of animals but of each other as well. So I think that speaks to the potential for merging the two, that there are certain elements in common and that both have been effective in their own spheres, but that one of them has very much missed a major purpose that the other one can fill in. So this is a picture from the Caring for Life program, which isn't an outdoor education program, but it does include some outdoor activities. So I thought early stage tree huggers, I thought that was cute. So to set the stage for the need for humane wilderness education, how do people interact with wilderness today? And this is a complex question with kind of a complex answer, because on the one hand, from one perspective, you could say people don't interact with wilderness enough, that half of the world's population now lives in an urban setting. This is expected to increase to 2/3 over coming decades. Children are spending less time outdoors on average, and there are a lot of demographic inequalities that in the US, for example, people of minority racial groups and of lower economic status are less likely to have access to national parks or to other types of wilderness areas. And this is something that can have a lot of negative impacts psychologically. There's the concept of nature deficit disorder being what happens when people are deprived. Basically, the idea is that our mind is fine-tuned to work best in a setting like the one in which we evolved, a natural setting surrounded by animals and plants. And then when we're deprived of this is the cause of a lot of the anxiety and mood disorders and just general malaise and confusion that people in the modern world largely struggle with. However, so on the one hand, people don't interact enough with wilderness. On the other hand, we interact way too much with wilderness in the sense that we have an enormous negative impact on the natural world. Of the human population of about 8 billion, 1.6 billion people are directly dependent on forests for their livelihood in industries like timber or logging for agriculture, hunting, bushmeat, foraging. And the rest of the population has an even larger impact, even though we're not directly interacting with wilderness. The effects of our lifestyles have resulted in only a quarter of all of the ice-free land on the planet still being relatively wild. 30% of the ice-free land on the planet is used for animal agriculture. So we use more of the planet is used to raise livestock and the crops that feed livestock for human consumption that is actually available to wildlife. And of course, we're also, as the UN recently acknowledged with its biodiversity report, we're in the midst of an unprecedented extinction event, one of only a few in the entire history of the Earth, and the first one caused by a single species. Up to 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the near future. So, and this is a result of how humans interact with nature. There is good news. There are improving trends in how people are choosing to engage with wilderness. In the United States, people who choose to go on wildlife-related activities is at an all-time high. So is spending on wildlife-related activities. And what's really good is that more and more people are choosing non-violent wildlife activities, things like wildlife watching, or like just hiking, as opposed to hunting and fishing, which is at an all-time low. So the overall balance is changing. And this is an international trend as well. Even though trophy hunting is often defended as being supposedly a great source of revenue for conservation efforts, that if you allow hunters to come in and shoot a rhino, then they'll raise money to breed more rhinos or something. But the fact is that in countries where trophy hunting occurs, it's a very, very small portion of the of GDP. That this was a study of 8 African countries with legal trophy hunting that found that trophy hunters make up, they're at most 1 in 1,000 tourists who visit the country, and they generate at most 2% of all tourism-related expenditure, most of which is not directly related to hunting. That's them ordering meals or getting a taxi. So hunting is largely irrelevant economically, but this is not reflected in government policy. So I cited in the last slide a report that found that that 7 times more people are watching animals than hunting them. But the U.S. Department of the Interior's spin on that was that hunting, fishing, and other outdoor activities contributed more than $156 billion, which isn't technically a lie, but it's very, very misleading because it's the other outdoor activities that are contributing the vast majority of that money. And that really speaks to kind of how indebted the many politicians are to the hunting lobby. And this is reflected by a lot of other policies since that have involved like creating a council to actively promote hunting to the public, that have involved expanding hunting and fishing opportunities in wildlife refuges. Which I really don't understand. How can something be a refuge if you're like, don't put this in it? But again, this is something that's true internationally. Even though people are more sympathetic to animals on a cultural level, this isn't reflected in government. Botswana, as you may know, recently re-legalized elephant hunting after having banned it for 5 years. There's a lot of talk in the UK now of re-legalizing fox hunting. Even though that was banned, and even though that issue is like really hurt politicians who've supported that in recent years. So really government, the decision makers are not on board with the positive trends. So there are a lot of major contradictions in the way that people relate to the natural world and to its other inhabitants. So on the one hand, outdoor enthusiasts, people who enjoy outdoor activities, are largely interested in animals. They like to watch animals. They like to encounter them, photograph them. And more prefer those kinds of nonviolent activities to doing something that hurts them. But on the other hand, we're hurting animals on a larger scale than ever before in history. And I think that by merging humane education and wilderness education, there's potential to bridge the gap here and to resolve this contradiction so that people who may choose a photographic safari over going hunting because they prefer that. But if you can really teach them about the sentience of the animals that they're seeing and the impact of human activities on them and the need to protect them, that in a way galvanizes them to then change their lifestyles, to have a less negative impact on animals, or to change who they vote for example. And also then to transform the sector of like nonviolent outdoor recreation from being just a competitor economically with hunting and fishing to being a directly oppositional force, which I think is important, so that it can actually replace activities that are harmful to animals. So, as far as examples, I haven't found anything that really is like a thorough, comprehensive integration of like humane education into an outdoor context. But things that come close, or at least come a tiny distance, the scout movement. This includes like the Boy and Girl Scout programs in many countries which do have a lot of sensitivity to animals. Kindness to animals is one of the core Scout ethics. There are a number of badges that relate to caring for animals, including dog care, veterinary medicine, even a Voice for Animals one that requires people who earn that badge to actually investigate animal rights issues and like talk to an animal rights activist, investigate, make an argument for or against pet declawing, or wearing animals as fur or eating them, which is really good. However, this is kind of counterbalanced by the fact that there are still badges in fishing and shooting and livestock farming. But at least there is a kind of a diversity of choices and information available. And this is something that a lot of humane societies and shelters have utilized to partner with local Scout chapters and offer activities for Scouts to earn badges in helping to care for animals or the environment. So here we have Girl Scouts who looks like they're studying a skunk. This is in a zoo, so it's of course a bit problematic. It's an institution, but I'm not going to go into that. This is just an illustration. Next example, ecotourism is really kind of the prime example of informal wilderness education. People who are going on like photo safaris or bird watching trips are not necessarily actively seeking to learn something. They're seeking like the thrill of encountering a new species or just like the beauty of the natural world. But they're going to come away from that learning a lot about ecology, learning a lot about the local history, about different species. So it is inadvertently educational, and it can be overtly educational as well. I should define it. Ecotourism in theory means ecologically friendly wilderness tourism. In practice, it's not a regulated industry, so there are a lot of ecotourist programs they're tourism in an ecosystem, but they're not tourism that's eco-friendly. So it's important, like if one wants to participate in an ecotourist package, like do some research, find out how ecologically friendly this program really is. Something I'm going to talk about now with an anecdote is how I think the profit motive can largely kind of overshadow any concern for animals or the environment. And this is something that I really believe could be counteracted by bringing in humane education. So last year, I went to the Africa Animal Welfare Conference in Nairobi, Kenya. And afterward, I went on a photographic safari in Masai Mara National Park. At one point, the driver got a tip on the radio that there was a cheetah and her babies. So we went driving off across the conservancy to where the cheetah was. and just comes speeding in and like right up to the cheetah and her cubs. And normally cheetahs are not really that human averse. They're not very shy. They're not very skittish. They mostly don't really care. Okay, but in this case, the mother cheetah was hunting for her kittens, and you can see there that, well, I think that's the mother. There are the antelope. And you can see sort of her half-grown kittens there. And because we came in making all this noise, the antelope, of course, look up. They're like, "What's going on?" And they see the cheetah, then they leave. And the mother cheetah, you could just see the anger in her face. And she was so pissed that we had interrupted her hunt, and now she would just have to start over from scratch, tracking another herd, stalking them to feed her babies. And what I would envision like a humane education-oriented ecotourism project doing differently would be to kind of like approach slowly, stop like a few hundred yards away from the cheetahs, sort of look with the binoculars, see what they're doing. If the cheetahs are just kind of lounging around, maybe come closer. But if the mother's stalking, like stay at a distance and explain to the passengers of the Jeep, like, I know that you're disappointed that you wanted to see the cheetah up close, but the mother needs to feed her babies. Like, I'm sure you can relate to that, like wanting to care for your family. And by staying at a distance here, you are doing a good thing for these cheetahs and using that as an opportunity to build empathy for the animal. But that's not being done enough. And I think that shows the need for integrating a humane education component, both for participants in these kinds of ventures and also for the employees and the people who are conducting them. Another example is alternative livelihood training. So this is another indirect example that this would incorporate training former poachers, former loggers, in some cases, like in India, former bear dancers, to earn a living in a different industry than in one that harms animals. And this is something that can actually lead even to recruiting a lot of former poachers, people formerly involved in harming animals, to become wildlife rangers or like wildlife crime investigators. And it addresses the fact that the vast majority of poachers don't really want to be poaching. It's based on desperation, that 96% say they would change jobs if there was another job that was available to them. And so even though this is more of a vocational program than wilderness education per se, I think that it's relevant in that it's still a really good example of how you can get people to completely change the way that they interact with the natural world and its inhabitants, which I believe should be a goal of wilderness education too. So maybe take a few tips for these kinds of programs. Finally, wilderness therapy, and I don't have much time, so I won't go much into this because I reached out to a bunch of wilderness therapy programs. Only one of them wrote back and said, well, they use therapy dogs sometimes, and when they walk around, they have a field guide, but that's it. They don't really have any lessons on animals. Otherwise, but I think there's a lot of potential. As a lot of the presentations here have discussed the therapeutic effects of working with animals, like treating injured animals, and this is something I think is transferable, whether to like watching wild animals or to treat, like to helping out as a rehab center, or to help animals that have been injured to readjust to the natural world. But again, this is not something that I know of being done. So that's pretty much all I have for you. So I'll open it up now to Q&A, but first I have two questions for all of you, because there is a shortage of specific examples I was able to find. I'm interested if anyone can recommend some like other case studies of programs they know of that have integrated humane education and wilderness education. And second, what would an ideal wilderness education program include? What are the most important things to teach people about wildlife and how to interact with it? So with that, thank you, and let's have a conversation.
months ago, I attended a teacher conference in Cape Town, and I'm sure you know that chickens are the closest we have. It's all over National Geographic. The closest living relative to the Tyrannosaurus Rex, literally. It's amazing. So there was a paleontologist from the University of Cape Town speaking to the teachers about paleontology within the curriculum. And there were no questions at the end of her speech. And I put up my hand and I said, I wonder, we should really be telling the children, you know, about the connection between chickens and Tyrannosaurus Rex. I mean, it's not me saying it, look at Geographic. And she said, oh, no, we don't want to put children off their food. And then I might say that the Western Cape Education Department chief came scuttling over to ask who I was, and I just thought, oh, what a pathetic, how pathetic.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah,
Well,
but it's what we're up against.
Yeah.
For the sake of the appetite of the children, we don't want to even let them know that this amazing creature, the hen, has survived all these millions of years.
Okay. 'Cause I mean, I've heard of like a lot of schools being hostile to evolution, but never for that reason.
You mentioned that there were studies of 8 African countries. I got some work that I've been asked to do for the church on Christianity in Africa.
Okay.
In Africa. Can you tell me what they are? Or we can talk about it after.
Certainly. I do. So I do have the sources here, which is probably way too small to read. It's so if you want to just write it down, the lion's share on the economic benefits of trophy hunting. So that's the source of that information came from. And I know it includes Zambia, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe. I couldn't tell you all of them.
So I just finished my master's, and as part of my capstone, I did a protocol proposal of a humane education curriculum as a requisite for public park visitation. So I really appreciate your point about public access to parks, because that's a huge, of course, issue too. So kind of considering how to incorporate humane ed while also, allowing access for all. But the closest thing I could find, I did a literature review, the closest thing I could find was Leave No Trace incorporation in programs. But one of the principles is, of course, interaction with wildlife and how to, but it's really frustrating because that seems to be kind of the one that's like pushed aside. It's a lot of focus on like, don't litter basically, and make sure you pee 200 feet from a river, that kind of stuff. So have you, in your experience in Washington, because you're in a prime real estate for wilderness, is there any more focus on that principle there?
Not really that I know of. It's like, animals, of course, will be brought up in things like Leave No Trace, but it's kind of only in like the broad ecological way that like we don't want to impact the environment, we don't want to threaten the species, but there's not really any engagement like, well, what happens if an animal gets stuck in plastic or something?
But it seems like that's a space for potential.
Definitely, yeah. I think you were first.
Yeah, just to add on that, actually, in your first question, we are running right now a program that involves humane education, wilderness education with the Ontario SPCA, and another program in Canada called Trails. And we use the Leave No Trace as well. And in Canada, there's some research that I've looked at that is quite extensive. So yeah, and I just had another question actually from a Canadian perspective. It's just I grew up in a rural town with lots of hunting, so I know tons of hunters, and I know many people here probably are vegans and vegetarians, and I agree with that. However, not everybody is, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts on a lot of hunters that I've spoke to and their perspectives are that they prefer to hunt, and in Canada it's quite strict rules on getting your gun license and hunting license. And they prefer to hunt than to get their meat from stores, and they feel like they actually are being more respectful.
Right.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, my focus on this is more on recreational hunting, which I'll admit that there is some blurring with the line, since a lot of people, they may go out, they may shoot something primarily for fun, but then they do eat it. So there is some blurring of that. If someone is like committedly choosing to hunt for their meat instead of supporting like agriculture. I mean, I can respect that to the extent that I would say it's preferable to the alternative. It's a more conscious decision that contributes to a smaller amount of animal suffering, and like that wouldn't be a priority for me in combating. It's more, to me, what the bigger problem is more sort of the normalization of hunting as like the default outdoor activity, that hunters are the guardians of the wilderness. Hunters are the primary like protectors of nature, and then just like weakening protections for parks and wilderness areas. So that's more on my focus, and I would say that that's really the large scale problem with hunting. Even though I wouldn't say that I morally agree with like subsistence hunting, but I would say that I have more respect for it than I do for factory farming. Yes.
I think that goes back to Theodore Roosevelt, that idea of hunting goes together with conservation and animal protection.
Right.
In national parks.
Right.
It was a big hunter.
It's a pervasive myth. It's really undercut by a lot of the policies. Like one of the first, Ryan Zink, he's no longer the Interior Secretary, but when he was, one of his first policies was to reverse the ban that had been passed under the previous administration on lead ammunition. And it's like, if hunters really wanted to protect animals, why would they want them to get lead poisoning? And so, I mean, the reason is because lead ammunition is a little bit cheaper than ammunition made from different metals, but that shows their first priority is corporate. It's not protecting wildlife at all. Also, please give me some more information later about your Humane Education Wilderness program. That'd be really useful for me.
We have time for 2 or 3 more questions.
Yeah, also in response to Humane Wilderness Education, there's a program led by Ian Redmond, who used to work with Diane Fossey, the gorillas.
Oh yeah.
He's the UNEP ambassador, and he chairs the Ape Alliance, and they run programs, particularly in Africa, which would be worth perhaps you looking at.
Okay.
And Born Free Foundation, I think, also have a sort of a checklist that you can look at if you're interested in ecotourism, and with suggestions to some verified organisations.
Right. Okay, yeah, thank you.
I just wondered if you had any more data on the trying to shift the poachers into a protection, because I know that in Africa they began some of that work over 20 years ago, but I haven't heard any data whether it's been successful or if other countries have looked at that and had any success with that.
Let's see. Let's see, the one that I cited, like 96% would change into another job, that was a 2017 study in Tanzania. That's this one, the NAP et al., Poachers in Poverty. As far as success stories, I do know of some programs, trying to remember the names of them. It's not poaching per se, but Wildlife SOS in India has done something very similar with their dancers, and we're rehabilitating them into different livelihoods, including like wildlife protection work. And I think BirdLife International has done some of that work, but I don't know off the top of my head the statistics on how effective it is.
I think we're going to have to stop because I hear people coming out, and unless there's one very quick question. Okay, that was incredible.